Does exposure to violent media increase the likelihood of engaging in violence? This debate has been fueled by tragic incidents, such as the murder of toddler James Bolger by two 10-year-old boys who'd reportedly watched the movie Child's Play 3 prior to committing this heinous act. Such events have sparked widespread concern about the influence of violent media on youthful behaviour. For example, some studies suggest that children may have witnessed over 8,000 TV murders by the age of 11. Not only this, but researchers report evidence of media content becoming more violent over time. For example, analyses of the James Bond franchise have found that as time went on, Bond films contained more violence, and the violence became stronger in nature.
The notion that violent media can shape behaviour is also echoed in popular culture. An iconic example of this is portrayed in the Simpsons episode Itchy, Scratchy and Marge, where Marge Simpson wages a one-person crusade against televised violence. But does Marge's stance on violent media hold weight? Let's examine the psychological evidence. The episode begins with Bart, Lisa and Maggie glued to the television screen watching Itchy and Scratchy, a cartoon infamous for its graphic violence, while Homer tinkers away downstairs in the basement on a spice rack for Marge. Maggie, having watched the cartoon's violent content, crawls downstairs and bashes Homer on his head with a mallet. Marge attributes Maggie's actions to the influence of Itchy and Scratchy and launches a crusade against violent content in children's media. At the core of Marge's argument lies the belief that children emulate what they see, which is a cornerstone of social learning theory.
This theory posits that behaviours, including violent ones, can be learned through observation and imitation. Observational learning of violent behaviour in children was explored by the psychologist Albert Bandura, who showed that if children were shown film footage of an adult attacking an inflatable doll, children would then interact violently with an identical doll when given the opportunity to play with it. It's thought that this process is part of children looking to adults to learn norms around acceptable and unacceptable behaviours, which may also come from consuming media content.
Furthermore, Marge's apprehension about media violence stems from a belief that repeated exposure can desensitize children to real-life violence. Desensitization theory suggests that exposure to violent content over time numbs us to it and makes us believe violence is the norm and not unusual. Sociologist George Gerbner found evidence that the more people in the US watched TV, the more violent they thought the world was, especially if they lived in neighbourhoods that had high crime rates. He argued how media often portray the world as more violent than it really is, giving the example of how in TV police dramas, a police officer often fires their handgun every 1 to 2 episodes, whereas in reality US police officers fired their handgun only very rarely in their entire career.
One study examining this compared members of the public who'd just seen a violent horror movie in a cinema with those who had watched a non-violent movie. When an actor working with them fell and needed help, they found that people who just watched the film took longer to help than those who'd seen the non-violent film. This effect only occurred after, but not before, watching the violent film. They argue that this impact on helping behaviour is one of many indicators that exposure to violent content can desensitize people to violence. Furthermore, recent evidence comes from social neuroscience work, which found evidence that the brain regions associated with emotion are less active in horror movie fans when they watch violent content compared to people who don't usually watch as much violent content.
In the episode, Marge debates with the creator of Itchy and Scratchy, Roger Myers, about whether violent cartoons promote violence. Myers contends that violence has nothing to do with cartoons since violence has predated the invention of them. While it is true that violence is nothing new and past societies were more violent, George Gerbner argues that there have never been so many depictions of extreme violence available to view as there are today. Moreover, this argument somewhat misses the point about the link between media consumption and violence. No social scientist claims that media is the sole factor in violent behaviour, but is still nonetheless one piece of a jigsaw that may contribute to engaging in violence. Perhaps for many well-adjusted, calm individuals, exposure to violent media content may not translate to violent action. But if a small percentage of millions are affected by what they consume, that can still translate to several thousands of violent individuals. More generally, violent content can also impact thinking and behaviours in non-obvious ways that are still detrimental to society, such as decreasing tolerance, sympathy for victims, and increasing verbal aggression.
Marge's campaign against Itchy and Scratchy is successful as the show tones down its violent content. Her call for censorship reflects broader societal concerns about regulation of media access to protect children. While censorship is intuitively appealing, it's also criticised as a potentially slippery slope that can result in increasing restriction on freedom. This dilemma is portrayed in The Simpsons, where the townsfolk attempt to censor Michelangelo's David, igniting a debate mirroring Marge's own conflict over Itchy and Scratchy, and having her rethink her belief on censorship. These days, very few social scientists argue for censorship of media content, not least because it's incredibly difficult to regulate and control online access to media. Perhaps an alternative approach that Marge could have argued for was the need to educate children about media consumption.
Longitudinal research taking place over a 15-year period demonstrated that in many countries, there is a compelling link between an early childhood preference for violent TV and later violence. However, intriguingly, this did not hold for children raised in agricultural kibbutz communes in Israel. They discovered that often in these kibbutz communal living settlements, parents would collectively work together to educate and talk with children about violent content and why violence was unacceptable. This seemed to inoculate the kibbutz children against the worst effects of exposure to violent media.
This work suggests education might be the answer. However, we have to remember that such work comes from a time when extremely violent content was not as readily available as it is now. It's much more challenging for modern-day parents to monitor their children's exposure to violent content. And with the ever-increasing realism of the violence depicted in media, the stakes are becoming increasingly higher in how we can go about protecting children from the effects of exposure to such violent content.